They brought her from Saxony in 1819 with a portfolio as neat as a ledger. Maria Josepha Amalia, pious, well-schooled, docile to confessors, daughter of a court that prized ceremony over noise. The portraits showed a steady gaze that diplomats called composure and ladies called good sense. Spain needed both. In the wake of a second marriage torn by fear and watching, the palace wanted a queen whose presence would feel like a chapel, clean, quiet, lit by rules. She approached the task with a mind like a notebook. From her physicians, Saxon men who had conversed with their Spanish counterparts in letters stitched with Latin courtesies, she carried instructions, habits to keep the self from fraying in rooms where others choose the hour, a diet that soothed, prayers that steadied, a caution about laudanum, friend, thief, written more like a plea than an order. Inside her traveling case, wrapped as if it were the host, a small leather-bound journal, a place to inventory days that might otherwise dissolve into someone else's story. It started, as all royal marriages now started, in procedure. The careful fittings, the low-voiced consultations, the arrangements that turned a bed into an instrument. But where the second queen had met terror, as if it were a tide one could only brace against, Maria Josepha met it as a problem. She learned angles and timings, the sequence of linens and oils, the choreography of breath. The ladies watched, astonished and relieved, as the bride made of humiliation a series of tasks. She did not pretend to be unafraid. She pretended, most days, to be unbroken. The intimacy became scheduled, the scheduling written down, the written words given the dignity of a locked drawer. Attempts were recorded like experiments: date, preparation, adjustments, outcome. The language refused melodrama, slight improvement, discomfort significant but bearable, no lasting injury. When pain flashed, she named it, and then closed the book so the pain could not breed hypotheses. The court whispered that she kept research notes. The truth is that she kept a self. Rumor, generous to no one, least of all the organized, built its little legends. That a confessor had forbidden consummation for months, that a physician from Vienna had declared the problem solvable if everyone obeyed him with military patience, that the queen prayed over the articles before each attempt. Each story wore a ring of plausibility without fitting perfectly. In palaces, that is what passes for truth. Ferdinand read the queen's method as experiment rather than insult. Method felt like obedience, and obedience, however fragile, felt like dignity. He tried, in his clumsy way, to meet her halfway. There were stretches when he accepted fewer appointments, nights when he permitted privacy to extend past the appointed knock, mornings when he let the physicians report to her first, then some small humiliation, a whisper at the wrong hour, a glance that lingered too long, would strike the old gong in his ribs, and the tightening would return. More observation, more entries in other people's ledgers, more control. She answered control with neutrality. It maddened him less than fear had, and frightened him more. When she spoke to Saxony, her letters praised gardens and devotions, and made of pain a footnote. He suspected, absurdly and sincerely, that she wrote reports, that foreign physicians collected his private history like stamps. The police net widened a little, then tightened. A courier was questioned for too long. A lady's trunk was searched gently and inexcusably. The Queen's journal was not touched. Perhaps even the suspicious recognize a reliquary when they see one. Outside, The world went on with its indifference toward royal dramas. American possessions slipped away with a regularity too relentless to be called crisis. Veterans opened taverns. Priests rebuilt sanctuaries that had once been field hospitals. Ministers counted coins like beads and found too few for a rosary. The court answered national diminishment with ceremony, and the couple answered personal failure with discipline. In that sense, they were matched. Years wore their groove. The triennial liberal rose and fell. That story belongs to the street and parade ground. The palace experienced it as a change in the density of fear. By 1823, the French came to set the clock back with the courtesy of bayonets kept politely sheathed in bulletins. In the royal rooms, the regiment endured. The queen endured. The king corrected. The ladies learned to be silent with a virtuosity that would have won medals if anyone gave medals for sparing people from their own words. Then at last, because even cautious calendars allow surprises, signs. Late 1828 into 1829, the quiet rearranged itself. The queen's complexion steadied. Nausea came and went in textbook rhythms. Sleep folded her without the usual negotiations. The physician's hand, placed to count pulses, stilled to feel something he had not felt in these chambers, the tiny drum within. He withdrew, like a man from a shrine. He used the cautious phrase first, una esperanza, and then, when weeks had hardened into meaning, the outright word, pregnant. Caution, fought joy, and lost. The palace lit its lamps, as if a fog had lifted. Ministers planned a christening, while pretending they were only preparing a quiet cradle. A priest blessed rooms and roots, then returned the next day and blessed them again. The king turned all his habits toward protection. He ordered guards doubled and gossip halved. He resummoned the best midwives and ignored a few good physicians because fear prefers familiar faces to competent ones. He calculated weeks with a fervor he had once spent on moon charts and found a number that comforted him. Soon, the queen became a country. Every step was measured, every appetite gently encouraged, every visitor a potential contagion weighed against the relief they might carry. Saxon advisors, at a distance, suggested air and rest, and as few interventions as the palace could tolerate. The palace could tolerate very few. The king demanded techniques, talismans, physicians of miracles, and physicians of protocol. He demanded, he would not have used the verb, but it fits, a say in the sequence of her care. The obstetrician who had recommended a private simplicity found himself outnumbered by courtiers who confused participation with love. In May 1829, the rhythm broke. Pains arrived not as heralds of promise, but as warning. Blood contradicted every plan. The physicians moved with the competence that comes of having failed often without shame. Some advised stillness and quiet. Others, seeing numbers fall where they should have risen, readied the room. The king's presence, urgent, useless, thickened the air. He demanded blessings and compresses and silence and answers. The answers were simple and terrible. Too soon. The delivery could not be delayed. It unfolded the way storms do when maps are no help. 10 minutes that felt like hours. An hour that felt like a verdict. The child, a girl by the size of her whale, lived as a sound more than a self. Baptized quickly by hands that shook, she faded as if the room's light were too heavy. The queen held that small heat until it cooled. In her journal, opened later by a trembling friend, one line appears beneath the day's date in a careful hand that did not tremble. God lent, God took. I ask only for quiet. Then the hand stops. Fever came as if it had been waiting outside the door for permission. The old phrase, childbed, does not capture how quickly a body can become a field where invisible armies finish their work. The physicians fought with cloth and tincture and prayer because there was nothing else to fight with. The king forbade talk of death, and by forbidding it, invited the word into every mouth. He ordered the windows shut against imaginary drafts. He ordered a priest present and then changed priests. He ordered that letters not be sent because names written in black make loss too real. He tried to command the crisis into a delay. Crisis does not take orders. According to one lady's recollection, he would not allow burial preparations for hours that became days. Whether this was a whole truth or a rumor pushed by grief into legend, the image took root. The room heavy with flowers, fighting a losing battle against the other smell. A king passing from prayer to denial, and back again as if faith could be made more fervent by refusing facts. When he yielded, at last, to the church's gentle insistence, he commissioned death masks with the same precision he had once given to supports and straps. The sculptor's wax recorded a poor truce. In death, faces tell fewer lies. The official bulletins said what bulletins say: fever, delicacy, resignation to God's will. May ended in mourning. The city, reading between the silk lines, understood a different grammar. A decade's machinery had delivered only a cradle of air. The courts of Europe received notices worded to elicit sympathy without inviting questions. The physicians wrote their last notes in smaller hands. The ladies closed a journal and placed it behind the false back of a cabinet, as if hiding paper could preserve the person who wrote on it. Ferdinand walked into a new silence. It was not the watchful hush he had always preferred, the kind he could arrange by controlling hinges. It was the silence earned by failing in public and in private at once. He walked through rooms that had been engineered to perform solution and saw, with the sudden clarity grief sometimes cruelly grants, a museum of means, devotional relics and medical devices mixed without shame. He slept badly and collected prayers the way he had once collected techniques, as if quantity could do what precision could not. From that day, he carried two convictions like weights in a coat: that the world was treacherous and that treachery could be defeated by more watching, more ritual, more refusal to admit vulnerability into sentences. Ministers, who dreaded his grief as much as his temper, found him softened for a week and then hardened beyond persuasion. He had buried a wife who learned him by method and a daughter whose entire life could be measured in the length of a psalm. He would not, he said, by what he did, rather than what he wrote, be mocked by fate again. Spain paid the price for this vow, the way countries pay for private decisions at the top, by waking each morning into a house ruled by a man who had concluded that mercy fails and only management survives. Files thickened. Doors acquired eyes. The palace's quiet, which had once been a symptom, became an instrument. And yet, for a month, grief's strange mercy, he visited the chapel at hours that surprised the staff. And once the guard outside swore, he heard the king whisper, not a prayer, but a sentence with no one's name in it. I was not made for this, and it was made for me. If it was confession, it had no absolution. When the court put away its black, the rooms were the same and not the same. The bed waited with its bell. The hinges remembered to keep their counsel. The journal slept behind wood that would not betray it. Madrid went on worrying bread and taxes and gossip. The treasury counted coins. The police counted names. The king counted breaths between footsteps he did not trust, and on a road neither he nor his ministers had paved, a new name appeared in correspondence with the inevitability of a tide: Maria Christina. They wrote her name on envelopes as if it could soothe a decade. Maria Christina of Naples and Sicily, not a stranger so much as a fold in the old Bourbon map. Daughter of Francis I, niece to Ferdinand, the family tree doubling back on itself with that confident carelessness dynasty's mistake for prudence. She came in late 1829 with a curriculum of composure, piety worn without fuss, a quick mind under a calm brow, and the practical schooling of a southern court that had survived revolutions by learning when to curtsy to the weather. The negotiations, so recently a death watch, moved with a speed that only famine and politics can teach. Spain needed a queen who could be a bridge between palace and street, between absolutist certainty and the fatigued wish of a country to be left alone long enough to heal. Christina arrived with trunks and tact, and that particular intelligence some women acquire when their lives have always been shared property. She read rooms the way a captain reads shoals. If she felt dread, she folded it small and kept it where no valet could find it. The wedding was a quieter architecture than the last, less parade, more intent. The palace had learned caution. Madrid, too. Blessings were given with the efficient tenderness of people who had buried enough to know brevity is a kind of respect. The chapel smelled of orange blossom and a newly sharpened future. A few old men in the back whispered dates rather than prayers. Succession sits in calendars as much as in cradles. Behind the curtains, the familiar apparatus waited. Linens in their stations, oils warmed to their appointed degrees, the old articles disguised as upholstery. The physicians, chastened by years of trying to turn ritual into rescue, spoke softly but clearly. Christina listened, eyes steady, lips a straight seam, and asked the kind of questions that make professionals grateful. Not why, but how. Not if, but when. In the hours that followed, she found the boundary every queen had met in this house. She did not break against it. She organized herself around it. Fear knocked. She answered with method, and more dangerously, for everyone who preferred objects to wills, judgment. Publicly, she worked at once to rearrange the household allegiances that had stiffened into habit. Her kindness traveled quickly, the kind that chooses, without fanfare, which dowry to redeem, which widow to seat near the fire, which servant's child should see a physician rather than a priest. She did not play at being beloved. She placed gentleness where it would multiply. Ministers noticed that the corridor outside her apartments grew busy with faces from factions that seldom shared staircases. She received all with the same unassailable courtesy. If she favored any party, it was the party of tomorrow. Within months, the first signs appeared. The same discreet changes, the measured steps, the regulated hours, the way a hand rests briefly on a doorframe as if steadying. Not the body, but the day, spooled through the household. Physicians counted and recounted. Ladies adjusted light and air. The chaplain borrowed fervor from years he had spent consoling the opposite news. In early 1830, the palace learned to breathe in the conditional tense again. The king, whose hope always arrived braided with fear, turned his old controls outward. Tasters doubled, doors refitted, letters sifted like flour. Surveillance, his most fluent language, returned with purpose. Christina understood the cost of being a country while also being a woman. She accepted that her letters would be opened, and still wrote them, careful, warm, informative in their silences. She did not pretend the peepholes were not there. She learned where they were and arranged her stillness accordingly. When the king arrived at hours not agreed upon, the ladies did not flutter. They repositioned a small portable wall of calm. The marriage did not transform into tenderness, but the nursery made a truce possible that policy had never granted this house. Long afternoons of counting kicks, of reading aloud from pious lives, with the voice one uses to teach a room how to remain. Then Christina did the thing palaces had tried to engineer for 2 decades and could not. She carried to term. On October 10th, 1830, Madrid woke to bells rung without apology. The infant Isabella let loose the righteous cry of a child unaware of the files opened in her name. The christening rehearsed Spain's old confidence: silver, water, sponsors whose title sounded like history clearing its throat. The king, whose happiness always held a shadow, stood with the stiffness of a man doing sums that would later be called law. Because the birth made law urgent, Spain had lived under a semi-Salic imagination that preferred sons. Fate had given none. So Ferdinand reached backward to reach forward. The Pragmatic Sanction, long prepared, long postponed, was at last proclaimed, clearing the path for a daughter to inherit what her father had failed to bequeath to sons. It was paperwork with the weight of a cannon. In salons and sacristies, men who liked certainty more than justice murmured the name Don Carlos, as if it were a prayer or a password. Quietly, the Carlist weather began to gather at the horizon. The nursery became a battlefield paved in velvet. A law had made a baby political. A baby made the law visible. Christina, no longer merely a wife, now a mother, and a strategy, proved as deft in politics as in rooms. She cultivated the moderates, the ministers who had opinions about roads and taxes rather than liturgies and thrones. She learned who, among the officers, tired of being told to police thoughts, which bishops preferred peace to quarrel, which writers could be counted on to praise law without turning it into a sermon about eternity. She set about the work of a future regent before the word was spoken aloud. She did not attempt to convert the king. She adjusted orbit around him. Ferdinand's relief, paradoxically, increased his anxieties. To secure his daughter, he sought to fortify the mother. Fortification in his vocabulary meant containment. There were more tasters. There were more checks. There were nights of sudden entry that sent nurses scurrying and left the queen sitting upright in that practiced stillness the watched must master. The peepholes, that obscene compromise between power and cowardice, multiplied. He called it prudence. The ladies called it what they could not write: the price. In 1832, the country's tremor moved under the palace floor. The king sickened. Gout, fevers, the fatigue of a life spent pushing panic through the bloodstream. Decisions thickened to the viscosity of honey. Christina did what able women in bad architecture have always done. She organized. She kept audiences small and necessary. She placed papers to the king's hand in the order required to coax signatures out of stubborn afternoons. She revised schedules so that governing did not tear the thin fabric the nursery had just woven. Opposition coalesced with the impersonal appetite of tides. Men who had once shouted El Deseado now hissed pragmatic as if the syllables were a slur. Priests who loved canon law more than they loved congregations found in Don Carlos a cleaner line from altar to throne. Pamphlets skittered beneath closed doors like dry leaves. In this noise, Christina began to collect the elements she could trust. The guard captain, whose loyalty was to order rather than to any cousin. The lawyer who could make decrees sound like precedent. The publisher who knew how to spare adjectives without dulling conviction. She was not building a faction. She was building daylight. The nursery doubled its blessing and its risk. In 1832, Maria Luisa Fernanda, a second daughter, arrived, a punctuation mark that turned opponents' mutters into open threat. 2 girls, and the law newly bent to accommodate them. The news hit Spain like the truth of a weather pattern everyone had pretended not to see. Carlist correspondence shed its silk. Even within the palace, men drew new maps of the future, with Christina at the center surrounded by daggers labeled tradition. Ferdinand, thinner and more suspicious, became a night wanderer. He visited the nursery at hours when even candles hesitate, watching the rhythm of tiny chests, then turning that same fixed gaze on any servant within reach. He burst into Christina's rooms, not from lust or cruelty. Those old engines had spent themselves, but from a wild arithmetic that insisted danger sleeps when he does. He demanded inventories of milk and of letters with the same solemnity. He made the mistake tired sovereigns make, believing that management is mercy when mercy is the only management left. Christina did not execute a palace coup. She executed a plan. She asked for a thing men seldom notice because it is not dramatic enough to brag about: continuity. She placed careful men in dull offices and told them to keep the dullness going. She learned the names of colonels who disliked adventure and bishops who preferred baptisms to politics. She cultivated the kind of loyalty that keeps schedules rather than rescues thrones. In rooms where one used to whisper about devices, people now whispered about decrees. Outside, Spain rehearsed its next catastrophe. The Carlist agitation swelled from correspondence to committees, from committees to oaths. The word civil attached itself to war with the inevitability of 2 magnets finding each other in a dark drawer. The capital felt the change before the countryside did. More uniforms at corners, more care with toasts, more sermons on obedience delivered by voices that sounded tired rather than triumphant. The city remembered how quickly cheering can become marching. In the midst of this, the queen performed the supreme art of palaces. She made ordinary things continue. The nursery kept its hours. The kitchens fed the same number of mouths. The chapel said the same prayers at the same bells. She understood that revolutions begin in breaks of rhythm. She offered rhythm as a sovereign act. The king, watching her move the world by not letting it catch, oscillated between gratitude and the old hunger to inspect. Love was not their grammar. Function was. It was enough to build a bridge to the next page. And so Spain found itself with a child queen in waiting, a mother who could count votes as well as rosaries, and a king who felt death at his shoulder and responded by looking through keyholes. The Pragmatic Sanction had converted a cradle into a standard and a family quarrel into a nation's. The palace, which had spent years learning to bend wood and leather to impossible errands, now bent language and law. It would hold, for a while. But law, like linen, must be laundered. And Spain, like any house too long, worried by silences, was already listening for the clatter downstairs. On a humid night near the end of summer, Christina stood by an open window and let the city's mixed music reach her. A hawker's call, a distant drum, a lullaby, sung wrong by a tired nurse. Somewhere, a man was changing a poster while pretending he was only straightening it. Somewhere, a boy repeated a name, Isabella, with the confidence children have when they are not yet afraid of history. The queen said the name aloud once, then again, as if testing the syllables for sturdiness. Behind her, the king was awake and counting. Ahead of them, Spain was awake and choosing. Illness arrived without ceremony and then refused to leave. In 1832, the court physicians began to document the slow choreography of a body that had spent decades trading sleep for vigilance. Gout flared, digestion soured, fevers came and went like envoys bearing bad news. The king, who had long believed that watching is a cure, responded by watching more. What began as prudence ossified into ritual. Servants learned that midnight was no longer a boundary, but a corridor. At any hour, the door could swing, and the sovereign could enter like a question no one knew how to answer. The taster's rite grew longer, precise to the minute. A footman rang a small bell after each spoonful. A clerk marked the interval before the dish could pass the threshold. The king counted heartbeats, and then, mistrusting even his own pulse, counted again. He ordered new peepholes, drilled in the walls between his rooms and the queen's. Little eyes of polished brass, hinged and oiled, so that he could reassure himself that no treachery unfolded while he napped. Sometimes he stared through them at nothing in particular, as if the act of gazing itself might pin the night to the floor. The ladies adjusted to this with a professionalism that would shame cynics. Chairs angled to spare modesty, screens nudged a finger's width when the shadow of an iris appeared. Christina endured the scrutiny the way one endures weather. Cloak tighter, pace measured, face steady. She had 2 daughters now, Isabella, whose name had become a law, and Maria Luisa Fernanda, a second blessing that made friends grateful and enemies frank. The nursery's rhythms, the trimmed lamps, the hushed steps, the confidence of nurses, were a kind of government the queen could actually perform. In that domestic republic, bottles were audited with less suspicion than letters, and the only conspiracy tolerated was the daily plot to keep fevers down. But the palace's other government kept bleeding inward. A guard captain stood too long under the nursery windows at night. A secretary mislaid a note about wet nurses and discovered it later on the king's desk, neatly folded, under a paperweight in the shape of a lion. The economy of fear debits even when it believes it is saving. The locksmith's invoices multiplied, the carpenter's too. A quartermaster recorded, with the dry humor of bureaucrats everywhere, that the palace now purchased hinges as if they were cannon. Elsewhere, shortages that had names, coal in the winter, wheat after a mean harvest, found their way into petitions that reached the king only to be stacked under memoranda on security. Ministers, who knew the price of salt and the cost of soldiers, waited in antechambers, while a physician briefed the sovereign on the angle of a bolt. Diplomats wrote home in that careful ink reserved for monarchs who may soon become precedents. They praised the queen's competence, then wondered whether the Pragmatic Sanction would hold once the hand that signed it stilled. They described a court where devotions were punctual and decisions were not, where a sovereign's appetite for surveillance had become the state's daily bread, where loyalty was measured not in service, but in access to corridors. Some, kinder than their governments, added a line no dispatch requires. Fear has made him exacting in small things, and small things have grown large around him. The Carlist agitation, fed by sermons and lineage charts, swelled like a bruise. Don Carlos's partisans spoke of God, where they meant inheritance. They spoke of custom, where they meant power. Oaths were taken in back rooms, in barns after Mass, in officers' messes, where old campaigns were remembered and new ones rehearsed. The word civil attached itself to war the way ivy attaches itself to stone. Quietly at first, then with a weight you cannot pry away without pieces of the wall. Within the palace, disease sharpened the king's suspicions to a painful shine. One afternoon, he startled a nurse by demanding to see the milk accounts, and then, half an hour later, accusing a clerk of miscopying a date in a letter that had nothing to do with milk or daughters or God. He ordered the chapel's chalice inspected for poison, as if malice could take liturgical form. He began requesting examinations before even the gentlest touch. Doctors present, physicians' hands cool on wrists, lest treachery smuggle itself through human skin. To be loved by such a man required endurance and a talent for not taking offense when offense was the only sensible emotion. In late 1832, he collapsed. The bulletins used the words they always do: fatigue, complications, gout, and Madrid's faces learned the old choreography of worry again. Glances at church doors, murmurs in markets, fingers crossing themselves without consulting theology. The Queen organized the chaos with a competence that made enemies grind their teeth. Papers she knew he must sign were stacked in an order so gentle a sick man could not resent it. Doors that did not need opening did not open. A priest sat where a minister might once have sat, and the palace learned to measure progress in the depth of a man's sleep rather than the boldness of his signature. In one of those decrepit days, Don Carlos's circle made its move, not yet with guns, but with papers. Pressure mounted to annul the Pragmatic, to return to a simpler male line, to undo a future already swaddled and fed. The king, drifting between lucidity and the dreams of men who have counted far too many hinges, reaffirmed what he had set in motion, his daughter's path. Whether this was conviction or Christina's grace at arranging decisions within reach, the effect was the same. A signature traced itself shakily along the bottom of a document that would make enemies call him usurper and friends call him merely late. Early 1833, he rallied, the way the very ill sometimes do. As if the body grants a last audition for life. He took the air. He allowed a minister 3 full sentences without a frown. He accepted a nurse's correction like a king rather than an inspector. The court exhaled. The exhalation did not last. Spring fed summer. Summer thickened into August. And with the heat came a return of the old pains, amplified by the cunning of age. The man who had tried to defeat fate with devices now tried to outstare it. He prowled. He prayed. He issued orders to rearrange carpets and council agendas with the same stubbornness, as if moving patterns on the floor could move time. The end arrived without theater. In September 1833, after days when his sentences wandered and nights when he rose to check peepholes he could no longer find, Ferdinand slipped behind a curtain nothing in the palace could part. The bulletins named illnesses decent men can pronounce. The faces of servants said what bulletins never do. Relief braided with grief. Pity for a life lived under siege by its own fears. Dread for the quarrel his dying would uncork. Christina stood as regent by temperament before the word became title. Now she stood by law. Isabella, scarcely 3, became the center of a circle drawn in gunpowder. What followed belongs to both rumor and record, and the two are not easily peeled apart. The physicians wrote their last notes, with hands that had learned to be small on the page. Autopsy, a practice not yet entirely innocent of scandal, was spoken of in rooms where curtains stayed closed at noon. Later generations would claim specimens were preserved, that drawings were made neat enough to teach and disturbing enough to lock away, that archives far from Madrid sheltered papers too human to print. We have diaries that mention sealed envelopes. We have families who tell stories at Christmas in which a great-grandfather saw a sketch and would not describe it. We have, above all, the feeling, so common in courts and cemeteries, that when official words finish, other words begin. But some facts stand clear. A nation inherited a child and a war. Men who had practiced obedience to a person now had to practice obedience to a law, and many discovered they preferred the former. The First Carlist War gathered itself, half theology and half nostalgia, and marched. Christina, new widow, old strategist, balanced cradles and councils, bishops and bayonets, paper and blood. The palace, which had spent years trying to engineer life in a single room, now had to engineer survival across provinces. As for the king's legacy, it refuses to stay politely on one shelf. In one cabinet, decrees, appointments, signatures that canceled and restored with equal fervor. In another, devices, bottles, diagrams, tools invented to turn intimacy into protocol, and protocol into hope. In a third, locked and unlabeled, the cost. Wives bent into instruments, servants trained into shadows, a country taught to stand very still while someone listened at the wall. There is a cruel symmetry in it. The man who had feared being an object became one, of study, of gossip, of the merciless interest that history applies to private pain when it discovers that private pain has public consequences. Yet to say only that would be to forgive the systems that made him possible. He was not merely a victim of bloodlines and apparatus. He was the author of habits that taught a nation to hold its breath. He did not invent cabinets of silence, but he stocked them. On the day they closed his eyes, the palace performed the old craft with consummate grace. The blinds were drawn, the clocks arrested, mirrors veiled, so that a soul in passing would not be distracted by its own face. A sculptor smoothed wax over features worn by calculation. A priest intoned the prayers that promised to unfurl what fear had knotted. Outside, Madrid listened to bells that tolled for a man and for a century of choices. In nurseries, nurses hushed small mouths that had begun to practice the word queen, and in one room, the bell at the headboard, so often rung, hung silent, its little tongue dark with disuse. Hinges, newly oiled, did not creak. The peepholes stared at empty air. The tasters ate their own dinners at a normal pace and did not look over their shoulders for a clerk with a sandglass. The apparatus slept. Spain could not,